Minnesota welcomed 25,000 Somali refugees between 1993 and 2018. Families fleeing civil war, seeking safety, building new lives. The American dream in action, right? A model refugee success story. Except in 2024, federal prosecutors indicted 70 individuals in what they called the largest pandemic fraud scheme in the nation's history. The alleged theft? $250 million. Not million with an asterisk, $250 million stolen from a federal nutrition program designed to feed hungry children during COVID-19. 70 people, $250 million. And at the center of it all, a tight-knit network operating within Minnesota's Somali community, exploiting a program meant to help the vulnerable. This isn't the first time. In 2018, federal authorities convicted 10 defendants in a separate $100 million daycare fraud scheme, also centered in the same community. That's $350 million in alleged and confirmed fraud across 2 major cases in 6 years. In this video, we'll explore how Minnesota became ground zero for federal fraud investigations, examine the daycare scheme that sent defendants to prison, analyze the current $250 million case working through the courts, and ask the difficult question, what systemic vulnerabilities allowed these schemes to flourish? We're going to examine the fraud allegations involving Minnesota's Somali community by exploring the Somali refugee population in Minnesota and the community structure that developed, the 2018 daycare fraud case, how it worked, who got caught, and the consequences. The 2024 Feeding Our Future case, the largest pandemic fraud in US history. The systemic vulnerabilities that enabled both schemes. And we'll conclude by looking at what federal prosecutors are doing differently this time and what these cases reveal about fraud prevention in refugee and immigrant communities. Let's start with understanding the population we're discussing. Minnesota is home to the largest Somali population in the United States, estimated between 57,000 and 74,000 people, according to the Minnesota State Demographic Center. The first wave arrived in the 1990s, following the collapse of Somalia's government and the ensuing civil war. They settled primarily in Minneapolis, particularly the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, which became known as Little Mogadishu. The community grew rapidly through both initial resettlement and secondary migration, Somalis from other states moving to Minnesota to join established networks. By 2019, approximately 13% of Minneapolis's population was African-born, with Somalis representing the largest single group. This concentration created something valuable: tight community bonds, mutual support networks, shared language and culture. Somali-owned businesses flourished. Community organizations emerged. Religious institutions provided social cohesion. But that same tight-knit structure, the informal networks, the community trust, the shared language that excluded outsiders, also created what federal prosecutors would later describe as ideal conditions for organized fraud schemes. What this means is simple. The very networks that helped refugees survive and thrive also made it difficult for external oversight to penetrate. When fraud occurred, it could spread through trusted community channels, hidden from authorities by language barriers and cultural insularity. That brings us to the first major case that put Minnesota's Somali community in federal crosshairs. In January 2018, federal authorities announced charges against 10 individuals in what prosecutors called a $100 million fraud scheme targeting Minnesota's child care assistance program. The scheme operated from 2014 through 2017, according to court documents. Here's how it worked. Minnesota provides childcare subsidies to low-income families through a state program that reimburses licensed daycare providers. The defendants created or took over legitimate daycare centers, then submitted false claims for children who didn't exist or weren't actually receiving care. The scheme's sophistication lay in its scale and coordination. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota, the defendants recruited parents to falsely claim their children attended specific daycares. Those parents signed documents saying their children received care. The daycare centers then billed the state for services never provided, and kickbacks flowed back to the recruited parents, typically 30% to 40% of the fraudulent payment. The numbers were staggering. One defendant alone, according to federal prosecutors, submitted $4 million in false claims. Another operated multiple daycare centers simultaneously, billing for more children than could physically fit in the facilities. Investigators found daycares claiming to care for 60 children with only 2 staff members, a ratio that would violate state licensing requirements by a factor of 6. The investigation, called Operation Daycare, involved the FBI, IRS criminal investigation, and the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Agents conducted surveillance, reviewed financial records, and interviewed hundreds of parents. They found a pattern. The same names appearing across multiple daycare centers, shell companies created to obscure ownership, and bank accounts showing suspicious transfers immediately after state reimbursements arrived. By 2020, all 10 defendants had been convicted. Sentences ranged from 3 to 20 years in federal prison. The court ordered restitution exceeding $100 million, though prosecutors acknowledged that recovering the stolen funds would be difficult, as most had been transferred overseas or spent. The significance of this case extends beyond the dollar amount. It established a template that federal investigators would recognize again just a few years later. Exploiting government programs with limited oversight, using community networks to recruit participants, and moving money quickly before authorities could intervene. This leads us to an even larger scheme. In 2024, federal prosecutors unsealed indictments in what they described as the largest pandemic fraud case in the nation. 70 defendants, $250 million. The program? Feeding Our Future, a non-profit that distributed federal funds meant to feed children during COVID-19. The federal child nutrition program expanded dramatically during the pandemic. With schools closed, the USDA relaxed oversight rules to get food to children quickly. Organizations could claim reimbursement for meals served at non-congregate sites, basically anywhere. Sponsors like Feeding Our Future would oversee multiple feeding sites and submit claims to the state for reimbursement. According to the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office, the defendants exploited every relaxed requirement. They created shell companies posing as feeding sites. They claimed to serve meals to thousands of children who didn't exist. They submitted invoices for food purchases that never happened. They laundered the money through a complex network of bank accounts, real estate purchases, and overseas wire transfers. The scale defies comprehension. Prosecutors allege that one defendant claimed to serve 5,000 meals per day from a single site, a facility that investigators later determined could barely accommodate 100 people. Another defendant allegedly purchased food invoices from a co-conspirator who owned a food distributor, creating fake documentation for millions of dollars in non-existent food purchases. The Minnesota Department of Education, which administered the program at the state level, raised red flags as early as 2020. According to reporting by Minnesota Public Radio, state officials noted that Feeding Our Future's claims had jumped from $3.4 million in 2019 to $197 million in 2021, a 5,700% increase in 2 years. But the nonprofit sued the state in federal court, arguing that the state was discriminating by delaying reimbursement. A federal judge ordered Minnesota to continue payments while the dispute was resolved. By the time the FBI raided sites in January 2022, an estimated $250 million had been paid out. Prosecutors alleged that defendants used the stolen funds to purchase luxury vehicles, properties in Minnesota and overseas, and to wire millions of dollars to foreign bank accounts, particularly in Kenya, China, and Somalia. 47 defendants have been charged so far. 18 have pleaded guilty. Trials for the remaining defendants are ongoing through 2025. The sentences for those convicted have been substantial, with one defendant receiving 20 years in federal prison in late 2024. What this reveals is a scheme that exploited 3 critical vulnerabilities: pandemic-era relaxed oversight, a complex reimbursement system dependent on sponsor organizations, and the same community networks that proved effective in the earlier daycare fraud. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture here. Two major fraud schemes, 6 years apart. Same community, same basic method. Exploit government programs with reimbursement structures. Use community networks to scale quickly. Move money before authorities respond. Combined alleged and confirmed losses, $350 million. All of this brings us to a crucial question. Why Minnesota's Somali community specifically? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't about ethnicity or religion. According to analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies who study transnational crime, refugee communities face unique pressures that can make them vulnerable to both fraud recruitment and fraud perpetration. These include economic marginalization, limited traditional employment opportunities, strong remittance pressures to support families overseas, and tight community networks where opportunities, legitimate or not, spread rapidly through trusted channels. Minnesota's specific circumstances compounded these factors. The state's generous social services created large funding streams. The Somali community's concentration meant that word of successful schemes could spread quickly. And critically, state oversight agencies lacked cultural competency and language capacity to effectively monitor programs within insular communities. But what does this really mean for fraud prevention and community relations going forward? The federal response presents several paths forward, each with distinct implications. Option 1. Enhanced oversight and cultural competency. Federal and state agencies could maintain current programs while implementing stricter verification requirements and hiring investigators with cultural and language expertise. The Minnesota Department of Human Services has already moved in this direction, requiring additional documentation for high-value claims and conducting more frequent site inspections. What would need to happen? Significant investment in bilingual investigators, community liaison positions, and database systems that flag statistical anomalies. The obstacle, cost, and the tension between fraud prevention and program accessibility. Tighter controls may discourage legitimate providers from participating. Option 2. Community-based prevention. Somali community organizations could take the lead in fraud prevention education and internal accountability. Several Minneapolis mosques and community centers have already begun financial literacy programs and discussions about fraud's impact on the community's reputation. This approach requires community leaders to acknowledge the problem publicly, a difficult step given fears of collective blame and increased discrimination. According to reporting by the Star Tribune, some community advocates worry that excessive focus on fraud cases feeds anti-immigrant sentiment and overlooks the thousands of Somali Minnesotans who operate legitimate businesses and contribute positively to the state. Option 3. Structural program reform. Minnesota could fundamentally redesign how it administers childcare assistance and nutrition programs, moving away from reimbursement models toward direct provision or heavily regulated contractor systems. The risk here is reducing program flexibility and potentially decreasing participation. The programs exist because vulnerable populations need them. Children need care and meals. Overly restrictive reforms might solve the fraud problem by making the programs so difficult to access that they fail to serve their intended purpose. So Minnesota welcomed 25,000 Somali refugees seeking the American dream. After examining the $100 million daycare fraud that sent 10 people to federal prison, the $250 million Feeding Our Future case with 70 defendants, and the systemic vulnerabilities that enabled both schemes, we can see that the story is far more complex than either model refugee integration or criminal community. Minnesota's Somali fraud cases aren't evidence of cultural criminality. They're evidence of what happens when generous public programs meet limited oversight capacity. Vulnerable populations face economic pressures, and tight community networks can be exploited by sophisticated bad actors. This matters because Minnesota isn't unique. Every state with significant refugee populations administers similar programs with similar vulnerabilities. The question isn't whether fraud will be attempted, it's whether authorities can detect and stop it before it scales to 9 figures. But what do you think? Should Minnesota redesign these programs fundamentally? Or would that punish legitimate providers and vulnerable children for the actions of fraudsters? Make sure to subscribe for more insightful analysis, in-depth assessments, and breaking news reports from around the world. We cut through the noise to bring you the data that matters.